All right. I think it's been fairly easy to see all the way through up to this point as we approach chapter 7. I think up to this point it's been pretty clear that there's a pattern to the development of things, a kind of a basic principle set forth out there and then illustrated, and then another principle and then illustrated. So there's a structure to this sermon that is pretty logical. When you come to this place in chapter 7 and verses 1 through 12, there are a lot of the commentators that call that in question, and they think that you've got sort of just miscellaneous teachings and proverbs that don't relate to each other very much. I want to challenge that. I think that there is a link and a connection between the various parts of this, and I want to try to bring that out, at least what I think the way things relate together here. Chapter 7 begins with this passage calling for mercy to be shown toward other people, not to be judgmental and critical. I think that can be related to some things that we've had in the teaching before. He's challenged us to show forth a righteousness that is superior, that exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. Chapter 5, verse 20. Then in chapter 5, verses 4 to 6 and 7, he says, if you just love those that love you and salute those that love you, what do you more than others? Even the Gentiles, even the publicans do the same thing. He's challenging for a superior righteousness. You shall be perfect as the Heavenly Father is perfect. Chapter 6, over and over again, don't be like the hypocrites in the way you do alms, in the way you pray, in the way you fast. Don't be like the hypocrites. Don't be like the Gentiles. When you come to the end of chapter 6 and in verse 32, he teaches that as people of faith, we ought not to be like the Gentiles who seek after and have this anxiety over the things that are going to sustain their lives, what they're going to eat, what they're going to drink, the things that they'll be clothed with. So a superior righteousness has been called for all the way through this sermon up to this point. It seems to me that there's a strong temptation when we begin to try to reach out for a more spiritual life and a pious life to be judgmental, to have a kind of a spiritual pride and arrogance and a self-righteousness. Then there's another connection. In the 6th chapter, in verses 1 through 18, he warned against doing pious acts to be seen of men, or for the applause of men, or for the glory of men. So at this point, we go from the idea of submitting our righteousness to the judgment of others and doing what we do in order to get their praise, to the idea of setting ourselves up as judges over other people. In fact, I guess these things would be almost two sides of one coin anyway. It would be a kind of a spiritual pride. You'd be proud of what you were doing if you did these religious acts for the praise of men, and you would feel that you were superior in the doing of that. And so you would be apt to be judgmental and critical on others who were not up to your level. And so it's no wonder in the world that he begins chapter 7 by saying, judge not that you be not judged. Notice another thing, a connection within this passage, verses 1 through 12. He says in the first part of it, judge not that you be not judged, for with what judgment you judge, ye shall be judged, and with what measure you meet, it shall be measured unto you. And so he says something here about the treatment that we're going to receive, and says it will be according to the same measure that we use with others. We'll be treated as we have treated others. Well, this passage ends with a reference to something like that. In verse 12, he says, all things therefore whatsoever ye would that men should do unto you, even so do ye also unto them, for this is the law and the prophets. So he says we'll receive treatment as we have treated others. And now comes to this, and at the end he says that we ought to treat others as we wish to be treated. So it seems to me that in the beginning and the end of this, that there's a kind of a unity and connectedness of thought that runs through it. Okay, as we try to break it down then, we first deal with this idea of showing mercy to others in verses 1 to 5. Jesus is not speaking against everything that could be called judging in this passage when he says, judge not that you be not judged. In fact, in verse 6, he already calls upon us to do some judging in the sense of making discrimination. Give not that which is holy unto the dogs, and neither cast your pearls before the swine. We have to make a judgment who these dogs are, who these swine are. And then in verses 15 and 16, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravening wolves. We have to make a judgment about who these are. And in verse 16 he says, by their fruits ye shall know them. Then finally, another good passage on the other side of this issue is 1 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 12, when after he told the Corinthian church that they ought to withdraw from this fellow that had his father's wife, he says, he speaks of that as a judging them that are within. He said, we don't judge them that are within. God judges them, but we judge or those that are without, but we judge them that are within, in the sense that we make a judgment when wrong has been done, and we take this action that 1 Corinthians chapter 5 speaks of. So in other words, there are other passages that speak of a judgment that is our duty to perform. So this has to be understood in a limited sense in terms of this context. And I think the thing that explains this is just this hypocritical, overly critical view of people. We begin to feel superior to other people, and we don't use the same measuring rod on ourselves that we do for other people. We become very demanding of other people, and it's a hypocritical, hypercritical kind of a judging that he has in mind here. And he warns that the same measuring rod that you use will be used. With what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged, and with what measure you meet, it shall be measured unto you. Well, that sounds fair, to get the same kind of judgment that you pronounced upon somebody else. But it's a hypocritical thing. And in verses 3 to 5, the hypocrisy is exposed here. And why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye? Now that's something like just a speck of dust or something. Speck of sawdust, perhaps. Why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? You got a log in your eye. This is one of the places where I think we have to admit that Jesus has a sense of humor. The very idea of a fellow with a log in his eye trying to get close enough to somebody to get a speck of sawdust out of his eye. So he sort of wants us to get at least a smile out of this. How wilt thou say to thy brother, let me cast out the mote out of thine eye, and lo, the beam is in thine own eye? How are you going to do a thing like that? How are you going to get close enough to him that you could do it? Thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam out of thine own eye, and then shalt thou see clearly to cast out the mote out of thy brother's eye. So this fellow's not interested in motes and beams. He got a log. He got a beam in his eye. Got a plank in his eye. So he's not interested in specks. It's a hypercritical, self-righteous attitude that he is manifesting in his judging. Instead of dealing with other people with mercy as he would hope God would use toward him, he makes him toe the line in the most circumspect way. and is without mercy. How do we want God to treat us? Well, with mercy. If we understand our need of mercy, we would want Him to be forgiving of our sins. Well, He moves then in verse 6 from that to teach us to show a wise discrimination in the handling of the truth. And so I think when we come to this passage, we already see that the judging here has to be understood in a limited and restricted sense by the context, because he calls upon us to do a judging in verse 6. Give not that which is holy unto the dogs, neither cast your pearls before the swine, lest haply they trample them under their feet, and turn and rend you. There are people that are like dogs spiritually, or like the swine. You wouldn't take the holy meat, for example, the sacrifice, that a part of it be offered to God and a part of it be eaten. You wouldn't take that holy flesh and throw it to the dogs. Don't give the thing that's holy unto dogs. Don't give the pearls before the swine. They won't have any appreciation for pearls. They come over and root around a little bit and find out that it's not something to eat, and they just not interested in the pearls at all. They just trample them under feet, and then they turn and they rend you. So he's teaching us about the approach of people without any interest in the gospel, trying to force the gospel on people that don't have any spiritual interest in it. So there are two things I think that this passage does. It shows us the limits on the judging that verse 1 spoke of. And then the other thing, how do you do this? How do you decide who the dogs are and the swine are? Well, I think you let them show what they are. That's what Jesus did. That we're going to study in the 13th chapter about His use of parables. And what He did was to use parables to sort of conceal the truth from people that didn't have any real interest in it, that would misuse it, and use it as a means of illustrating the truth and communicating the truth to people that did have a real interest in it. For example, when He gave the parable of the sower, He gave the parable without the explanation, and His disciples come to Him and they say, what did this mean? Well, they get more. They show a heart that has a desire for more and for understanding. But the parables, somebody that didn't have any interest in that would have just gone home. He wouldn't have come and asked. And so in that way the parables conceal the truth and communicated it to another group at the same time. So I think He used these various devices to find out what was in people. Find out who was going to have a real interest in the truth and who was not. And He would not just impose the truth on people against their will when they were going to misuse it. Well, what then is a passage on prayer given? Why is it given here in verses 7 through 11? It seems to me that we are ready to seek something, and we've had some teaching that shows us the need of something, that show our own inadequacies. The teaching about not judging lest we be judged, and the distinction that we're called upon to make in verse 6 when He says, give not that which is holy unto the dogs. Those are difficult duties that He has spoken of, and they make us wonder how we can do that. They create these feelings of inadequacy. But the fact of the business is, it seems to me that this whole sermon does that. When you see from chapter 5 the demands of the law, it really exposes our inadequacy and our need of grace. And the various teaching we've had in chapter 6 would tend to do the same thing. And so it seems to me very natural that in verse 7 he would begin to say that you can get help if you come seeking it and pursuing it. Ask, knock, seek. And so this is the encouragement that we need, that there'll be grace to help if we seek it diligently. Ask, and it shall be given you. Seek, and you shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you. There's a persistence about this. The tense of the Greek verb suggests keep on asking, keep on seeking, keep on knocking. There's a persistence that is involved in this. For everyone that asketh receiveth. He that seeketh findeth, and to him that knocketh it shall be opened. Or what man is there? And here's some more reasoning. He's going to convince us of the reasonableness of what he's taught. Or what man is there of you, who if his son shall ask him for a loaf, will give him a stone? Or if he shall ask for a fish, will give him a serpent? If ye then, being evil, know how to give good gifts unto your children, how much more shall your Father who is in heaven give good gifts to them that ask him? So, even earthly fathers respond to the request of their children by giving them things that would be good for them. And how much more the Father in heaven will give good gifts to them that ask him. What do you do when your child doesn't ask for a fish, but he asks for a serpent? You have to give him a fish anyway, don't you? You have to realize that they don't always know the thing that's going to be best for them. And I think that's the thing that we have to realize about God's answers to prayers, that we don't always know the thing that we need to ask, and that he gives good gifts. If we don't have any more sense than to ask for a poisonous snake, he's not going to give us that. He's going to give us the fish or whatever it is that will be good for us instead. Now, there's some confirmation of the approach I've taken to this, that it's really more spiritual blessings and spiritual needs that are under consideration here than it is just ordinary material needs. There's confirmation of this. I was going to say in the parallel in Luke. There's a parallel passage in Luke, and in Luke 11:13, when he says, "How much more shall the Father in heaven give you good things?" He doesn't say good things in Luke. He says, "Give you the Holy Spirit." It seems to me that even the context here suggests spiritual things, the gift of the Spirit and the things, the grace that we need to help us to deal with difficult duties and to be adequate for this task that he puts upon us here. Then, that brings us to a concluding summary, another therefore. All things, therefore, whatsoever ye would that men should do unto you, even so do ye also unto them. For this is the law and the prophets. Now, I suggested at the beginning of the approach to chapter 7 a kind of a link between verses 1 and 2 and verse 12. He says you're going to be treated as you have treated other people. And so the conclusion, after all this development of things, the conclusion is, therefore, all things whatsoever ye would that men should do unto you, even so do ye also unto them. So it serves as a kind of a conclusion to this passage, therefore, drawing a conclusion. For this reason, behave according to this principle. But it seems to me also, when you look at where this statement is in the Sermon on the Mount, from verse 13 on, he's reaching a conclusion. And these sections after this are going to call for decision and call for action to be taken and commitment to be made. So we've reached the end of his presentation of the exposition of the righteousness of the law here when we come to verse 12. And so it seems to me that this therefore may draw a conclusion from all that he's presented so far. Now there's something else that would sort of tend in that direction. Look at chapter 22 in verse 40. He'd said here, all things whatever you would that men should do unto you, do ye also unto them. For he says, this is the law and the prophets. The whole thing is summarized in that, according to that principle. Well, in the 22nd chapter, and in verse 40, when this fellow's come up, the lawyer from the Pharisees wanted to know what about the great commandment in the law, and he said, thou shalt love the Lord thy God, and that's the greatest, and then second like unto it, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And in verse 40 he says, on these two commandments the whole law hangeth, and the prophets. Well, that's what you've got in Matthew 7:12. In the whole law hangs on those two commandments, he says. And in Matthew 7:12, this is the law and the prophets, that ye should, whatever you would that men do to you, do ye also unto them. In other words, this is just another way of saying, expressing that commandment. Love your neighbor as yourself. It finally brings us to the point, we've got all these details, all these things in the law that have said, behave in this way and behave in that way in these various situations. But we come to this ambiguous situation, and we don't know what to do, how to apply the law in a particular situation. Well, he suggests to us that we ought to put ourselves in the place of that other fellow and act toward him as if that were ourselves. Whatever you would want someone to do toward you, do so unto them. That's a principle that will settle a whole lot of things, a whole lot of ambiguities and situations where it may be difficult to know what to do. We can always put ourselves in the place of that other fellow and do the thing toward them that we would have them do unto them. And that is loving our neighbors as ourselves. The whole law and the prophets is summed up in that. That is, so far as it involves love of the neighbor. There are other passages, Romans 13, Galatians 5:14, other passages where the law is said to have been all summarized in these teachings, these commandments. So, with that therefore then, after all the teaching he's presented, the righteousness of the kingdom, now a therefore that summarizes the whole thing. So his presentation's pretty complete. He is ready to bring his lesson to a conclusion. Here's what I want him. And to call for decision and for action. In verses 13 and following, he begins to paint the picture of people as on the road to judgment. He says there are two ways to travel. Verses 13 and 14. Enter ye in by the narrow gate. So here's this challenging for action now. Enter in by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leads to destruction. Many are they that enter in thereby. For narrow is the gate, and straight in the way that leadeth unto life, and few are they that find it. So two ways are described, and one of them is the way he's been describing. When you hear his sermon, you've got to say, "Boy, that's a demanding thing." If he's going to ask of me that I have the law written in my heart, I can't even be an adulterer or a murderer at heart. If I've got to be very careful that my doing of acts of righteousness is not to seek the applause of men and to get praise from men. This is a demanding thing. Well, Jesus calls upon people to enter the narrow gate. It is narrow. The way is straightened. S-T-R-A-I-T, not G-H-T. It's the word which means, to be like in a tight spot with difficulty and not much room to move or around. And even it's used sometimes in context of tribulation and difficulty of various kinds. So he has not led people to be under any kind of an illusion about his teaching. The way is narrow, the way is straight. On the other hand, there's the broad way that many enter. It's the obvious way. There's nothing demanding about that. It's the easy way. People can do whatever they want to do on that way. And so most people take that way. But he calls upon us to make the right choice in this because these end up at different cities. That broad way that most people take is a way that leads to destruction. The narrow gate, the straightened way, this is the one that he by all means urges us to take, because this is the way that leads to life. And that's the reason that we must by all means take that way. So there's the choice that Jesus puts before this audience of his. He's sitting there on that mountainside, all these crowds of people gather around him, and a choice of two ways, not a lot of ways, two, and calls upon them to make the right decision in this matter. Now, as he goes on in the next section, he's going to show that there are a lot of people that are going to be trying to help them and hurt them, really. He warns against false guides in verses 15 to 20. False prophets, people that would come along who would turn people away from the right way, the narrow way and the straightened way. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravening wolves, just vicious wolves that will attack you. They don't look like that on the outside. They come in sheep's clothing. But if you could strip off that sheep's clothing and see what they really are inside, they are vicious wolves that would attack the sheep. I think this sheep's clothing is explained in this context when it speaks of people later on. Verse 22, it says, there would be people that will say, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy by thy name? By thy name cast out demons? By thy name do many mighty works? It's this profession they make, this claim, this association with the name of Christ. The sheep clothing conceals what they are. What they are really, though, is something destructive that will lead people away from the way that leads to life. Well, there's encouragement given, verses 16 to 20. They can be recognized, they can be avoided. By their fruits ye shall know them. Do men gather grapes of thorns, or figs of thistles? Even so, every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but the corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. And so there's something in that natural illustration that is encouraging. He says in verse 20, therefore by their fruits ye shall know them. You see the fruit and you know what the nature of them is. I think that's explained. This fruit is explained by verses 21 and 22, when he speaks of those who don't have, that they're not obedient to the will of the Father, and instead, in verse 23, he says, depart from me, ye that work iniquity, or lawlessness. These are people that don't have any regard for the will of God. They ignore the law, they go their own way. That's the fruit. When you see the fruit, you'll know what they really are. And so that's the encouragement, to believe that they can be recognized and they can be avoided. He speaks then of entering the kingdom. Verses 21 to 23. Who will enter into the kingdom of heaven? Not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father who is in heaven. And so his first point is that obedience is decisive. Obedience, doing the will of the Father in heaven. Not just calling me Lord, but doing the will of my Father is in heaven. That's the one who enters into the kingdom of heaven. He speaks of people in verse 22 who are self-deceived. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy by thy name? And by thy name cast out demons? And by thy name do many mighty works? So they've lived their lives calling him Lord, making this profession. They show up at the judgment, and when it appears that they'll be turned away, they plead. They're still calling him Lord, Lord, and say, we've prophesied by your name. We've done all these mighty things by your name. And then he makes his judgment on them, verse 23. And then will I profess unto them, I never knew you. He's not saying I never knew about you, but he had not come into this relationship. He does not acknowledge them. He does not recognize them, know them in that sense. I never knew you. Here they were. They prophesied by his name. They cast out demons by his name. They did many mighty works in his name. So they claim. And he says, I never knew you. Depart from me, ye that work iniquity. Now that's, the word iniquity just means lawlessness. It's the opposite of doing the will of the Father in heaven. This is the person who ignores the law and just goes his own way. And that was the difference between those who would enter into the kingdom of heaven and those who would not. Here, and here, by the way, is those who take the broad way, who just work lawlessness, do as they please, in spite of whatever the law may say. And on the other hand, the narrow way is those that commit to the will of the Father in heaven. Jesus closes with a warning. And it's a warning that's given in a parable, the parable of the two builders. Every one, therefore, is the conclusion again. Therefore, every one, therefore, that heareth these words of mine. That's interesting, that he spoke of those that do the will of my Father who is in heaven. But when he comes to this conclusion, he speaks of those that hear these words of mine and do them. So those are just used interchangeably. The will of the Father in heaven has become these words of mine. This is the expression of the will of the Father in heaven. Everyone therefore that heareth these words of mine and doeth them shall be likened unto a wise man who built his house upon the rock. Luke's account of this says he dug deep and got down to the rock and built on the rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon that house, and it fell not, for it was founded upon the rock. And everyone that heareth these words of mine and doeth them not shall be likened unto a foolish man who built his house upon the sand. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and smote upon that house, and it fell, and great was the fall thereof. I think the simplicity of Jesus in the categories is something to be noticed. There are only two categories. There's the broad way and the narrow way. And he calls upon us to enter the narrow way. There's the good tree and the bad tree. And now there's the wise builder and the foolish builder. The choice that is to be made is not a choice of whether we're going to build a house or not. Everybody's building. As we live our lives, we build. So the choice is not whether to build or not to build, but it is only a choice of whether we will build well or whether we will build foolishly. Whether we'll get down to the rock and build on the rock, or just be so impatient we just put the house wherever we can, build it on the sand. Now in fair weather it wouldn't make any difference. Either house could stand in fair weather. But the storm is coming. There are things coming that are going to test this house and all that is in it. Whether it will stand or not will depend upon whether it's got the right kind of foundation. Well, what does that mean? Well, the difference is in whether you hear these words of mine and do them, or whether you hear these words of mine and do them not. It's a question of obedience or disobedience. So he closes with a word about where the place of safety is, or the way of safety, the only real security. It's not those who hear the word, these words of mine. It's not those who know them. It's not those who teach them. It's not those who defend them. Not those who debate about them. It's those who hear these words of mine and do them that will have the kind of foundation that will enable him to stand whatever test comes. And there are a lot of tests that come before this life is even over. Undoubtedly, the ultimate application of this, though, is the judgment that will test what is in this house and whether it's on the foundation or not. And the only one that will stand will be those who have heard the words of the Lord and done them. I hope this tape will stand. I'll put this back up here in a minute. To let me read the crowd reaction. The last thing he says here was, in the order of the Greek, it says, the fall thereof was great. And he quits. It's all over. I mean, he's been talking. I don't know how long it would have taken him to deliver this sermon. But I wonder about that crowd. The fall thereof was great. The silence must have been just deafening there. And that's the way that ended. Well, the reaction. Verse 28 and 29. And it came to pass when Jesus had finished these words, the multitudes were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as their scribes. The crowd was stunned. That's the meaning of astonished there. It's a word which means that a person has been struck a blow. It's like a person has received some kind of a blow that just left him stunned. And that's the way they felt. When they heard this sermon of Jesus. Astonished, just stunned at his teaching, as though they'd been struck a blow. Now what was it they saw in that stunned them so much? Well, it says, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as their scribes. The scribes may have gone back and found support in the ancient rabbis and quoted authority. Rabbi so-and-so taught this. But Jesus sets all of that on one side, brushes aside. All of that is so much rubble. And alongside it, he says, I say unto you. And he says, this is the real truth about it. I say unto you. He spoke as one having authority. There's more than that in this that shows the authority. He claims in chapter 5, 17 and following to be the fulfillment of the Old Testament. In chapter 7, verse 23, when he speaks of that day, the judgment, he is the one that people appear before and who decides and who says, depart from me, ye that work iniquity. And then finally, in this very last part of the speech, in verses 24 to 27, he is the one whose words have to be not only heard, but obeyed. And a person's destiny will be decided on the basis of whether he hears these words of Jesus and does them or not. Well, sometimes the Sermon on the Mount is treated as just a kind of an ethical thing, just a system of ethics. But as we close here, what we find out is that the teacher stands above the teaching. And that the thing that is so astonishing to these people is who this is and the implied claim that he makes when he speaks with the authority that he does. So it's not just the teaching as a system of ethics, but it is this person that comes out and shows something about who he is in this teaching that he does and the way he does it. And that's the impressive thing for this crowd as it comes to an end.